Well, good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more people to come online, and we'll kick off with tonight's webinar. Just getting a few more people coming online there at the moment, so we'll just give it another minute or so. So for those people joining us tonight, my name is Brett Littler. I'm a Senior Land Service Officer with currently working with the Drought Adoption Program and the Southern New South Wales Innovation Hub. And I'll be running this meeting this evening with myself and David Harbison. So we'll just give it another minute before we kick it into gear. Okay, I think we're starting to get a few people online now, Harbo. So we'll kick it into gear. As I said, my name's Brett Littler. But before we start tonight, I'd like to acknowledge that we are dialing in from what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to the traditional people who are the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which I'm standing on today, and also extend that to the traditional custodians that you are all representing today, as well as elders past, present, and emerging. So tonight we're doing a presentation on productive pastures, managing ground cover and livestock performance. Co-presenting with myself tonight is David Harbison. David, I've worked with for a number of years and have a lot of respect for. He's really has been an expert in agriculture, well regarded. He's got extensive experience advising right throughout the rural sector in research education through his business DR Agriculture. He provides services across plant and soil nutrition, crop and pasture management, and also deals with livestock production systems and agribusiness consulting. David's done a huge amount of work in research and extension, including projects with MLA, Southern Australian Research and Development Institute, and his current project focus on pasture fertility and species persistence, underscoring his dedication to advancing sustainable agricultural practices. And look, over my career with David, I've always found it great to have a chat, the practical information that we get from him. So hopefully we can get that out tonight. Myself, as I said, I'm a Senior Land Service Officer with the local land services, currently working in the Drought Adoption Program. And this is funded through the Southern New South Wales Innovation Hub. Sorry, my computer's just decided to lock up. So tonight, as we go through this webinar, would be really good if you want to ask questions. You've got a couple of options, but really don't text them to me, as I've had some friends do on some of these webinars. On the right-hand side, there's a Q&A tab. You can type in your questions there. These come through. We'll collate those questions and be able to go through and put them through as they come up. It's just to help with some of the duplication. Sometimes we get quite a few same questions, and by us being able to bring them together, we'll be able to get them through for David and myself to answer. So go into that Q&A section and can ask questions there, type in your questions there. So this webinar tonight event is brought to you by the Drought Adoption Officer Program. The Drought Adoption Officer Program receives funding from the Australian Government Future Drought Fund through the Southern New South Wales Innovation Hub and the Southern Queensland Northern New South Wales Hub. So that is what I'm currently funded under through my project and working in this, and this has enabled myself to do a large body of work looking at things like confinement feeding and things like that. But to kick this evening's presentation off, I'll now hand over to David. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Brett, and to all, welcome. Apologies for, I've just turned the camera off in the hope that the dear old satellite in regional New South Wales enables us to have a reasonable bit of service and get the presentation across. So Brett, whenever you're ready, I'll be communicating with Brett just on a change of slides. So let's hook into it. But in short, I mean, I've been in pastures for a few days now. The grey hair is sort of signalling how long I've been there. But what I'd like to share tonight is just, I suppose, some of my learnings over 35 or 40 years, managing pastures. What does productivity look like? What does persistence look like? And some of the trigger points in terms of, you know, the quick and easy one, time to get on, time to get off. You know, it's pretty easy to say. It's often a lot more difficult to actually do and complete. And then, you know, I don't think there's any breaking news in the ground cover targets, but again, I'll cover a few of those. So let's look at managing pastures to start with. Thanks, Brett. And, you know, in layman's terms, I suppose I want to know and help clients in my own system, but also the others is, you know, where are the money buttons in pasture management? And realistically, you know, it's not rocket science, but it's things that you have control over. You know, lots of things that we do in agriculture, we've got to be accountable for. Water use efficiency, how much rainfall lands, how much we make use of. You know, I believe that's on us. You know, a strong contingent of that is obviously how much we retain in the soil and pasture landscape through ground cover instead of letting it all, you know, wash away. That in itself can be strongly influenced by your grazing strategy. And so simple things like that can allow people to, A, just get more water. And I think, as I've said to someone before, if you got 50 mils in a storm and 48 if it run off, you know, go and write 2 mils on the rainfall record, not 50, and then see how your rainfall for the year looks. Because they're things that we can cover and we want to control. Soil and plant health is totally within our spectrum of you know, how we look after it and how productive pastures can be. And certainly, you know, weeds, insects, disease, I'm not going to spend any great length of time on those at all tonight, but they're in the background as to how we should be looking after our system. But I'd like to sort of cover off, you know, some of the bigger, simple things. And I suppose I'm a reasonably basic individual that looks at the 80-20 rule pretty religiously. And I like to get that 80% bang for 20% of the effort. So let's have a look at pasture management, Brett, and we'll see what's, you know, how we go. I want to start with this study, and I lean on this study a hell of a lot. It's now 25 years old, as you can see, and it came out of the New Zealand Grasslands Association in 1999. The simple question of a collection of farmers, and over 1,000 responses were given into this paper that Daly put together, but it was a simple fact, or simple question that was asked, and people were given the chance to respond. You know, list the important factors and significant events influencing the pasture persistence of a key paddock. Now, whilst the word persistence is there, I think there's many attributes of these responses that I would say the pasture performance or the pasture productivity of a key paddock. And next slide, Brett. It's no surprise when you look at what was given in that here's the top responses that, and there was many responses obviously, but collectively, you know, how people worded it, put it into these categories that, you know, soil health and regular fertiliser accounted for 29% of the responses, grazing management 28%, species 22%, and you can read the rest. So I look at that and suddenly say in the top three, which were a very clear-cut top three, that account for 79% of why good pastures are good pastures is what I'm going to say. I mean, yes, we know it's the actions and activities that go on. And if I say to a lot of my clients, I said, you know, without being rude to anybody, you know, have a look at the dill in the mirror, because that dill there is the person that's totally responsible for those first three. Who makes the decision about regular fertiliser? And it doesn't have to be granular by any means. Let's just call it regular nutrition programs, whether it's organic, compost. I don't really give an issue on that front. It's a case of understanding there are no free lunches in any of our pasture systems. Every truckload of product that we march off the property, you know, I say to people, wave goodbye to that truckload. That's good. There it's gone. But wave goodbye nutrition, wave goodbye fertility. It's all been taken out. And we as custodians of the land or managers of the land, we've got to look at how we can replace, where required, that fertility that we've just sold and cashed in. And so, you know, who's in charge of soil health and fertiliser? You know, that's me. Who's in charge of grazing management? That's me. Who's in charge of the species there to start with? Typically, that's me. So, you know, I'm responsible for 80% of what goes on in our good pastures. Yes, there might be people say, oh, you need moisture, you need this. In the big picture, they run into a very minor component compared to what our role as managers of our pastures, managers of our land, as to why they perform. Obviously, persistence was the key word in this data set. And, you know, without a persistent pasture, you don't have a strong performing pasture. Yes, it's possible to have the, you know, the more short-term, highly productive pastures that some of the mixers are doing today. That's great. They're there for a distinct purpose and they run their course. There's plenty of other, you know, pasture tablelands country that is, you know, sown out originally as a hope of never to come back in some cases. And so they're the, you know, situations we've got to be mindful of and we've got to manage them. Thanks, Brett. And, you know, it's no surprise, a lot of you would have seen such a slide, the old nutrient, what is the most limiting nutrient in the system? Keep going, Brett, with those ones. It's, you know, we look at that, we can get a soil test. At the end of the day, there's a collection of, you know, essentially 16 plant essential nutrients. Not all of those are critical to the animal, but there's also nutrients that are critical to the animal that are not essential to the plant, the likes of selenium and cobalt. You know, not essential plant nutrients. And so we've still got to make sure they're getting uptaken into the plant in order for the animal to get those. But the simple understanding of where your soil health or where plant nutrition is in order to try and have productive pastures, we need to know that. And this curve, it's very simple, being able to, whether it's through soil testing or other means, plant tissue testing, knowing where your status is. It's critical in order to be able to make good business decisions in the future. Thanks, Brett. Made up of 3 typical pools. And again, this is going back to Soil Science 101, but the simple factor is the chemical pool, the physical pool, the biological pool. I'm a full believer that, you know, yes, we can get a soil test and cover off a lot of the chemical pool. How often do we test the physical pool? I mean, I've had many, many paddocks that people have been disappointed in. I've got all the fertility in the world. I've done X, I've done Y. This paddock still won't go. And then you walk into the paddock and try and put a shovel into it, and it's damn near impossible. And so it really becomes a case of their soil physical structure is impeding their plant performance. It's not the level of nutrition that may be being applied. And in line with that physical characteristic, if you can't get a shovel into it, can you imagine being water trying to, you know, infiltrate into such a soil? It's impossible to get water into. So a lot of the times our nutrient responses are held back by some physical constraint. That might also pick up, you know, not only compaction layers, it might pick up toxic layers that could be obviously chemically related, or it could be, you know, potentially a gypsum layer or something like that that might be more deep set in the soil type itself. But you know, at the end of the day, the biological pool, and I'm not convinced we've got accurate measures of what soil biology should be or what the magical numbers are. But I'm a full believer that if I can get healthy plant growth, in order for plant roots to take up nutrients, they exude acids or exudates in the soil. I liken it to those exudates being basically red frogs to the soil biology. And when you get soil biology running on red frogs, they're rapidly reproducing, they're cycling nutrients, they're cycling organic matter, and the whole contribution comes together on the next slide, where we try and get all these effects to overlap. And if you, whilst I haven't been able to get my coloured pen to cover in that circle where all 3, or that area that all 3 circles overlap, that's where we're getting serious soil health. And it's not until you get, and our challenge is to try and get that overlapping as much as we can in order to try and have the healthiest system we've got. Thanks, Brett. So that sort of takes, you know, a lot of the fertility side of things that we're in charge of. From a grazing management point of view, and this is a story that can go, how long's a piece of string? We've seen the advent of wire and water and cell grazing on 3 days. We've seen the rotational grazing on longer sections like that. It's also out to, there's still plenty of set stocking or continuous grazing going on. But you've got to look at it basically from two sides of things. So you can understand the animal's intake needs, and they've got a certain amount of energy and protein and the likes that Brett will cover off in good time. And you've also got to turn around to look at it from a plant's perspective as to how does it recharge itself, get itself to a stage where it's actively growing. The big thing that it's a bit of an oxymoron to say, but you make no money looking at grass. And what I call grazing for performance is that I have a bit of an issue with some of the extreme long rest periods that are advocated when it comes to pasture performance. Yes, in terms of persistence and regeneration, I can cope with that if that's what your goals are and targets are. However, if we're looking to make, continuous profit on profit, then I think we've got to look more at the plant and get our grazing management to suit where that plant's at, instead of necessarily just being set by a clock and when I should be back into those paddocks. Overlying all this is the fact that your pasture base or your soil base, that is your biggest asset on your farm. I say we cannot afford to be resowing too often. At the end of the day, we want to get as much mileage out of those good pastures that we've established for as long as we can. And that again comes back to the dill in the mirror as to whether we can run that pasture to the ground in 3 years, 5 years, or whether we can very well manage that pasture and still have a productive pasture 10, 15, 20 years down the track. That all comes in line with obviously when to get on, when to get off in the grazing systems. It's the 3-day grazer, yep, they just get on according to the calendar. Is that necessarily the right time according to the plant? Or has some of that material that you're putting stock onto in that system, has it gone off and they're not getting the best out of it? There's all those discussions that can go on. I don't believe there is a right and wrong. You've got to look into each individual business to see what they're trying to achieve. Thanks, Brett. So, the 3 phases of pasture growth, hopefully this is not new to you, to too many, I should say. Obviously, the very early stages of establishment or regrowing after pasture, and that can depend how hard you graze at a particular time. We don't wish to graze into phase 1, and this is a graph out of ProGraze. Phase 2 in the middle there, when you've got active growing, green leaf there, that's the time and the money buttons in the grazing industry. If we can keep our pastures in phase 2, good to high production, good to high quality, that is rocket fuel to animal performance. The flip side, and yes, we do want plants to sometimes, depending on species, get into that reproductive stage. And it's also important in terms of some of our better temperate species that they do get rest. It's not necessarily they have to have rest year in, year out, but they also want to have rest at certain times of the year. Quite often, the likes of Phalaris, a recharge period at the back end of spring. Yes, I want the seed head to emerge, but I don't necessarily need it to set seed. But that Phalaris plant in that back end of spring is recharging at carbohydrate levels. It's developing tillers for the following autumn. And so we've got to, understand the plant growth of the species we've got. If I put that into a tropical species, that whole curve literally comes from, now onwards. There's been reasonable rain in lots of New South Wales of the recent 10 days or so. A lot of summer active grasses and the tropical grasses will be looking to get going quickly. And they'll grow rapid amounts of feed. We just got to make sure that we're using it at that time. Thanks, Brett. And it's in line with that then you look at these phase 1, 2 and 3 from an animal's viewpoint, and they make the ultimate choice. They're going to sit there and pull the ice cream out of any diet that's offered to them. And so when this establishment phase, if we're not looking after and staying off this slow growth or the recharge period when plants are been destocked and letting it get established enough before we go back into that paddock, it's highly digestible. That young green leaf is fantastic, but there's not much of it. animals have got to do a lot of walking in order to get their intake requirements if they can when it's very young and not much on offer. And so again, from an animal performance point of view, we want to stay off that phase 1. Phase 2, as I said, here's the rocket fuel. You've got both things in your phase. And phase 3, the reproductive stage, generally you're seeing a declining digestibility of the material that's on offer. Fantastic for an aged cow or something like that to make use of. It's not to say that we waste that feed at that stage. You can build yourself a haystack, and then you can turn around and, we also want to make sure that we open those canopies up for the following season. There's plenty of times where in the last 2 or 3 big wet seasons where a lot of temperate grasses have left so much trash that we've lost our clover in the following years. So we do need to have to try and eat some of that residue or eat some of that phase 3 grass in order to open the canopy up to get a lot of the subclover going, and a lot of the annuals for that matter. I mean, ryegrass, yes, there'll be barley grass or other less desirable grasses come through, but in the absence of the canopy being opened, you won't get any clover either. So thanks, Brett. And here's there's 2 slides here, and Brett can flick through these. I just want you to have a look at this one's on temperate pastures, and typically that 70% digestibility on your left-hand axis there, the high production zone, this is phase 2. And as we step into phase 3, into early flowering, you're starting to see digestibility decline. You'll see the energy levels of a lot of those temperate pasture species starting to drop off. And in order to, maintaining that dry stock, you're now into those taller rank pastures that, as I just said, perhaps the dry cow or something like that is best used to get that material through the animal. It hasn't come at a huge opportunity cost of young growing stock. You've got a fully grown animal on there that can do it a bit tough if they need to, but trying to get stock to, eat generally degraded rank phase 3 material, they would normally need some supplementation or they'd be going backwards. And you can see on the right-hand side, the energy levels there. Of particular note, when we go to the tropicals, you're sort of in the temperates, you're starting at 11 down to sort of 7 when you start to get into that undigestible material. To the tropical slide, Brett, and you'll see immediately that the vegetative material immediately down to sort of 60% digestibility, and we've lost about a meg of energy. Now, for those that are in that environment, yes, there's usually plenty of it we need in terms of that vegetative growth when it's in gangbusters through the summer. We've got to try and make sure that we utilise as much of that growth as we can. Typically, animals can eat more of that or need to eat more of that in order to get the same energy and animal performance. But it's also it goes off a bit quicker in terms of its digestibility. So that's all I would say in terms of the difference between tropicals. It's certainly a productive grass in the north and plenty through the central west now. We've just got to make sure we've got the right class of stock into the right material in order to get that animal performance that we're talking to or aiming at. Thanks, Brett. So when it comes to the plant itself, and this is probably where leading into a bit of Brett's confinement feeding side of things, how much grazing do we want to do? And there's a lot of, I think many hopefully understand that, plants shed roots underneath in order to cope with how it is. You'll see this slide here that thanks to the back paddock pasture program, but it's also US data that they've picked up, that you can use 50% of the plant, and generally speaking, the plant doesn't shed any roots. But as soon as you start to overgraze, be it through 70% usage of the material or worst case, almost overgrazing on the right-hand side there at 90%, the plant roots basically shed and then they're stopping growing. And you can see that at 70% dry matter intake or chewing off of that plant, those 50% of those roots stop growing for 17 days. Now, as a productive system, we can't afford for plants not to be growing, let alone the roots not taking up plant to the system. And so we use that sort of information to say, do not duck into phase 1, I should say, stay in phase 2. And if you go to the next one, Brett had put some numbers on what those roots and percentage of stop growing look like. And as you see on the left-hand side, you can nearly graze 50% of the plant and you've hardly pruned a root and you've caused no stoppage in root growth. But as soon as you start impacting on root growth, on shoot growth, the roots are pruned and you really set a plant back in a big way. And that's the productivity opportunity that we've got to stay out of. Thanks, Brett. So the trigger points, this is probably the easiest bit to say. There's lots of people that have said the beer can on its end or beer can on its side, time to get on, time to get off. It's, again, I get back to basically avoid eating yourself into phase one. Destock, rest, treasure your pasture base. That's your asset. Hang on to it at all costs. Get the confinement feeding out. Hang on to those pastures. Do not overgraze that root system. And if you think of that overgrazed root system, imagine that if that was on a low health plane and you've suddenly taken 60, 70, 80% of your root scope off a plant, get a dry time, what's the chance of that survival? There's a lot of, good science out there with regards to soil health and plant. And the one that I really like in the phosphorus side of things, the stock agents have said since I was a lad going to stock sales with my father that, the stock agents can tell the stock that come off supered country or, well nutritioned country. And that's simply the fact that they're a bit shinier. They're getting what I say to people, they've got pastures running on octane 98 or 98 octane. The lesser underdone or the low fertility paddocks, they're more like running on E10. So there is a significant difference in animal performance depending on what goes down the gullet. So I think we've got to watch out for those. Phosphorus is a critical element in root growth and shoot growth, sure. I liken it to, as a fellow put it to me once before, that the dynamics of phosphorus in the root is like the irrigation water pipe. If you go from a 1-inch pipe to a 2-inch pipe, you have 4 times the flow rate. That's like having a 1 mil plant root versus a 2 mil plant root. And if you can suddenly have a whole heap of healthy 2 mil plant roots and your water flow is 4 times, there's an element of pure drought resistedness that you're imposing on your system purely through to a good soil health carrying on. Thanks, Brett. Get on, get off in terms of putting numbers to it. And there is a difference, I believe, in the cattle versus sheep. And depending on where you sit in your enterprise, you may like to look at those numbers. But realistically, 2 to 2.5 tonnes a hectare is where I like to sort of get onto pasture if I can. Again, trying to get off it, that 1,200 kilos or 1,000 kilos on a push for cattle. And you've got to consider just how well cattle, I have seen cattle graze very short in the drought. I can, am convinced that they can get what I used to call sheep short. But realistically, they're scrambling once they start trying to get enough feed when it's less than 1,200 kilos of dry matter. So from an animal intake point of view, they start not getting enough energy. Let alone protein requirements once they've got to scavenge for feed. Sheep, again, different enterprise, a bit closer to the ground, then you're starting a bit earlier and getting off a bit later. The situation there is that so long as you're just not eating too far into phase one, okay? And of course, at the end of the day, when we do get pushed sometimes in seasonal challenges that are there, we may eat back into 500 kilos or something like that. And there's a photo just coming up there next, Brett, I think that's just, how short 500 kilos is. A DPI photo there of 500 kilos of food on offer. When you can start seeing the metal ring pretty clearly, you're pretty short. And I think that's a time where, you've certainly overgrazed. You've got a lot of plant root shedding in that environment. Thanks, Brett. Ground cover, look, this is a very quick one. We'd all love 100% ground cover 100% of the time. I think we're in dream world. We know that that's not always going to happen. It'd be nice to be able to achieve that. But at the same time, having that 100% of ground cover 100% of the time, it is to the detriment of the annuals unless we can manage, what our levels of ground cover are. And particularly if you're in a autumn or a winter's area and you want winter annuals, then you do need to open the canopy up so that there is some daylight hitting the ground and allowing those annuals to come away. And obviously subclover is a key driver of that whole system. So, we can't just rely on almost a thicket or a thatch of cover thinking we're doing a wonderful job, because it will cost us desirable species. And that's, again, but at the end of the day, we don't want to denude it. We want to protect our pasture. We want to protect our asset that's there. So the soil and pasture are the two bits that are critical to us. And that's the whole livestock supply of food. At the end of the day, if we can't grow it, short of being a feedlot, you don't have the chance to produce. Thanks, Brett. And so the take home, pretty simple. And again, going back to the 80-20 rule, there's some not negotiables as far as I'm concerned, and simply know where your soil health is at. There's a lot of producers I still meet and see and speak to, and the simple answer of, do you know where your soil health is? Oh no, how do you do that? Well, soil testing is a tool, a shovel's a tool. There's plenty of ways that we can have a good look at it. So, but it's the absence of knowing where any of that is just it's mind-boggling to me that we don't have a good grip on how healthy our system is. Understand your dry matter stock needs, obviously quality and quantity. When do you need it? When do you lamb? When do you calve? When are you looking to wean? Or when are those high demand periods? And how does your system cater for it? So to make sure you do that. And at the bottom line, I think, I know that the most benefits are achieved when we do the basics well. And again, that comes back to that slide from New Zealand. At the end of the day, we're in charge of soil health and keeping that nutrition program up to our soil and our plant, and consequently to the animal. We're in charge of grazing management, and you've just got to understand the plants and the species that you've chosen to put there. How do we get the best from them? So I'll leave it there, Brett. Thank you. And questions if there are.
I can't see any questions come through there currently. No. Okay. We'll head on. Thanks for that, Harvo. Okay. I'll keep going here now. Look, it's one of these ones, and Harvo's set the picture up very well for us. He's gone through, talked about the handbrakes, if you like, with some of the pastures, looking at the pasture. What I would like to say to people is, what is your current situation? Where are you currently at? And it's one of those ones, the importance of getting out and actually having a look at your pastures. Have a look if you've been lucky enough to be under this rain and what that's done to your pasture. Where are you? Just recently, we've done a pasture quality work in the central tableland zone. The ag team, Sarah, Phil, Lawrence and the like, Pete Evans and the like, have been through and done a huge amount of pasture work looking at some of the pasture qualities. Huge amount of results looking at things, and this is an old example, but over a wide range, and that quality of the feed has been hugely varied depending on the stage. And the feed samples that we took were really sort of in that spring period, and what we found was huge variation. Pretty much what Harvo was saying, reinforcing that quality of that feed is really dictated by a number of factors: species, the fertility, the nutrition that's gone on to that feed. And we saw huge ranges in feeds, and you can see on the left-hand side, the crude proteins. We had improved and unimproved feeds during summer that went anywhere from 6.5 through to 42% protein. Might have been a bit too high at 42, but we won't get into that one. And in unimproved, we had things down 3.3 to through to 19.3 for crude protein. Energies, again, sort of depending on the quality, anywhere from 8.7 to 14.7, unimproved 5.3 to 12.2. And then sort of, you need to think, what are the implications? Currently, if we've got some of those paddocks out there and think back to that pasture curve that David had, where he showed that once that pasture starts to move up into that later stage, into that reproductive, which is what we've seen, we're seeing that quality of that feed decline quite significantly. All of a sudden, if we're looking at those animals out in those paddocks, what do we need to do, and how should we be managing them? Obviously, if we've got feed starting to decline, it's one of those ones where you've got to say, okay, are we better off weaning these calves, weaning these lambs off these ewes and the like? And just little numbers to keep in the back of your mind. I talk about absolute bottom end for For livestock and a dry animal, we talk about 8 and 8, 7 and 7. If it's lactating and late pregnancy, that 12% crude protein and 12 energy. Growth, we're talking about 12 plus crude protein and energy up at 10 plus. And finishing, depending on the age, we're looking at crude protein up to 16% invariably, and sort of 11 to 12 megs of energy. So it really does vary, but you need to have a look at what is your actual situation that you currently have. These are a couple of photos, and definitely it's one of these ones where we're starting to see these feeds in some areas really declines quite substantially, and we know it's really a good time right at the moment to get out and have a look at those pastures. Particularly now we've had some of this rain, and I'll talk about that briefly. We will see some changes depending on what species are there and how they respond to that rainfall event. But it really is important to get out and actively look at the pasture. I suggest that, the photo on the right in that scenario there, we're dealing there. When I did the pasture cut on this pasture here, believe it or not, it came back at 26 kilograms dry matter per hectare. That's one small bale feed. So having those animals, they're going to have a huge amount of load. They're simply not going to be able to eat, and the damage as Arbo's put through is substantial. We're going to have a long time trying to get those plants to recover. So right now it's time to take stock, have a look at what your situation is, and also very important that you do look at where you are with your livestock, and what is actually happening. So take stock, look at where you are, and the photo of those sheep there, obviously they're chasing that feed, they're walking around. We've got lambs on ewes. It really is not an ideal scenario, if you like, but the damage that those sheep being on that pasture and the like. So looking at those options of what we actually do to those situations, to those animals and the pastures. This is a photo I've borrowed off Bob Freeban, and look, Bob's pretty much in line with what Harbo was talking about, that protecting those perennial pastures and the importance of keeping those plants there, not grazing them into the ground, as Harbo said, keeping that 70% ground cover plus that 500 kilograms, and the protection of those pastures and how they respond. It really is, and this photo was taken by Bob a few years ago now, but it shows 3 weeks after about 20 mils of rain, and how those pastures, if they're looked after, will respond. And it really is an important one to look at, particularly at the moment, where we have been lucky enough in some areas to have that rain, and particularly in some areas where we've got some pasture species, and Harbo talked about the tropical pastures that will really respond, those C4s that will take off with that rain. But the importance of looking after them so that they do have that chance of growing and going currently with the current season. So what I would say, if you've assessed those paddocks and you're starting to hit some of the benchmarks that Harbo's talking about, you're starting to really chew them down, you're starting to get below that 1,000 kilograms dry matter to the hectare and the like, should you be looking at locking those animals up? I would definitely be doing that, looking at protecting those paddocks, bring those animals in, so you're allowing that feed to get away. The primary objective of that confinement feeding type situation is really to maintain flock and herd productivity. We know out in those paddock situations, by having those animals chasing that short green pick, they expel a lot of energy. And what we tend to see, particularly now in this scenario where we do have this short green, well, I hope we've got some short green pick, is that those animals will chase that green pick, and we'll see animals really come off in condition, and that then can have a flow-on effect to the following year with the reproductive side of things and everything. Big thing is, by reducing that grazing pressure on the pasture, we're really able to maintain that minimum pasture base and get that pasture to come away. The other thing I would say at the moment, it was quite interesting driving back from Dubbo this afternoon with a colleague of mine, the change in just the last couple of days in some of these paddocks that we're starting to see, the change of colour, some of the stubbles that we're seeing some of the weathering effect. The more rain it gets, the more nutrition runs out. So looking at those type of paddocks as an option to put animals on, but once again thinking about what do I need to feed to maintain these cows and the like. So confinement feeding, I'm a huge fan of it. Being able to lock them up and manage that introduction back onto that green feed is a vitally important thing. I'm not going to go into the information about confinement feeding tonight and the do's, the don'ts, the hows. We could be here for a week if I start doing that. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that to you tonight. What I would say is that there is a guide out there to confinement feeding of sheep and cattle in New South Wales, and we will send that out with the resources. There's lots of information looking at that type of stuff. What I would say is it doesn't have to be complicated. Keep it simple. The old KISS mentality, keep it simple, stupid. Sometimes at the moment, particularly with the way the season's been, locking those animals up into some smaller paddocks will allow other paddocks to get away. A bit of targeted feeding. So if possible, use what you have on farm. What I would also say, just briefly, when we're looking at this, if we've got some of these confinement feeding setups and you've gone into the effort of setting up these areas, it can be also used at other times. And particularly, in some areas at the moment, I know in the central tablelands, there were some areas that were sort of on their knife edge, and now with this rain, they'll have a second spring. It gives you that option of locking them up, just letting that feed get away. But also we can use it for things like yard weaning and educating animals, so preparing them to feed. Also, we've looked at joining and confinement, which is something we'll add shortly. But also minimises some of the issues, say filera, staggers and the like. But really the biggest one that I see is it allows you to spell some of those pastures and really look after them, allow them to regenerate, to get up into those benchmarks that Harbo talked about and allow that height. We really know, and part of the training I've done over the last couple of days was looking at how important height is on animal intake and how it impacts their performance. So, really important that, particularly for sheep and cattle, that we need to get that height that needs to get up. And as Harbo's pointed out, that's also vitally important for the plant and trying to manage it into that phase 2, if you like, of the pasture. The other thing you can use it for is also in these scenarios is biosecurity or quarantine areas. Also, one that we've seen over the last couple of years is also, particularly with some of these areas, and now we've had some of this summer rain, thinking about going forward, the issues with worms. By spelling some of these paddocks and grazing with different animals, it may help us to actually look at some of our worm control. But the big one and the last point is stopping this green drought. It's one of these ones that we will see when we get that short green pick, that we will see condition really come off those animals because of the amount of time that they'll spend out grazing in a paddock. If we've got these animals out in a paddock situation and they're really chasing that green pick, we all of a sudden know generally an animal with the feed sort of 10 plus centimetres, we know that they'll graze, fill up in sort of anywhere from 4 to 7 hours, depending on the animal and the situation. In these scenarios where that feed is really limiting, we'll see those animals graze for an extended period, chasing that feed and just simply not able to consume enough to even meet their basic requirements. So all of a sudden we'll see that condition really strip off those animals. So trying to avoid that green drought situation, I think you need to have at least some area that you've got that you can feed them into, or at the very least, particularly at the moment, thinking about using what you've got. If you've got stubble paddocks, and spoke with a couple of staff members earlier on today, maybe that's an option, looking at feeding in those paddocks and in that situation currently. So definitely with the current season that we currently have, it's important to look at your management, how we're going to manage those animals going forward, so we protect that pasture and protect that important resource and thing that we spend money on, our pastures, but also that then looks after our animals. I think that pretty well sums up what we wanted to go through this evening. Is there any questions out there, Nissa?
Yeah, there's a comment there from Christine. She's just referencing that she likes using Farming Forecaster to understand the soil moisture and where it's at and how it translates to pasture growth. If you had any comments on that.
Yes, definitely. Farming forecast, we've actually had a bit of training over on the last couple of days, and depending on the region, you may or may not have it. We've got it in the Hunter, Central Tablelands, Riverina, Southeast region and the like. And it's a very, very useful tool. And what we have seen is the effect that this rain has had in some of these areas. We're seeing some of this moisture lift up quite substantially. If you're lucky enough to be in a site that's got grass grow modelling, it can show you what's actually happening with in some of those areas. One of the areas that we actually put up to have a look at over the last couple of days in the response to rain is over in your way, Harbo, where we had the king of things loosen in the modelled pasture. It's really shown the response that we'll get with that loosen in those scenarios. Harbo, would you like to make a comment on that?
Yeah, certainly, Brett. Thank you. Look, and the farming forecaster has certainly given us that opportunity. And yes, they're not everywhere, but they're a good guide as to just where that profile and where the plant is actually drawing moisture from. That's a big one we've seen earlier on in the last couple of years. Obviously, the seasons have run completely with us, 2022 being ridiculously wet, put a lot of moisture deep in the profile that to a large extent allowed a lot of the deep-rooted perennials to pull moisture from greater depth in the slightly drier time. So they were still pumping along and growing good dry matter when things slightly got dry on top. So it's a good tool to have. It's obviously limited in its distribution at this stage, but if you have a look at it again, there's a good spread that gives us an idea. And obviously, second to that, I would say there's no substitute just even for the shovel, just to when you can start to easily put the shovel to the full depth, be it 25 or 20 centimetres, whatever your shovel depth might be. There's two things that gives it, and it's certainly a quick snapshot on the depth of moisture that we've got, but it also gives you that immediate snapshot of your soil physical parameters. And when you're starting to have good rain and you still can't get that shovel in, there's certainly times where we've got to have a look at how can we improve that physical bucket. So, no, my comments, Brett.
Thank you. Is there any other questions?
No, that's all, Brett.
No, got off lightly. What I would ask with people who are online tonight is there's a QR code here on the left-hand side of the screen. If you could use your phone to scan that, and we'll have a survey about this webinar this evening. Also, if you've got any other questions, you can still type them into the team, and we may not answer them, but we can definitely go through and find that information. And follow up with the producers if they don't want it answered, asked here tonight now. So definitely an option there. Harbo, I've got a question for you. Your thoughts, I mean, we're going out to a wider audience here this evening. There's a huge variation between where different places are going to be and the like. Your thoughts on this current rainfall event that we've had with some of, particularly in the last, the follow-up on top of the rain over the last couple of weeks in some areas?
Yeah, it's a good one, Brett, in the fact that obviously central and northern New South Wales, where we do and can get a lot of summer natives, a lot of improved summer species in the tropicals, they are going to go on a reasonable to good soil health package they are going to grow serious grass, and it creates an opportunity reasonably quickly. I mean, it's not unusual for phase 2 summer perennials or the tropicals that they would punch every bit of 80 to 100 and in places 120, 30 kilos of dry matter a day. So they need to have the health package underneath them to be able to do that. But if water's not a limiting factor, they can certainly generate some serious grass. Now, it's a two-edged sword, and sometimes those that are in the north, they've got the stocking capacity to meet that growth, and that's what they've developed their business on. Bring it back through the central west and perhaps more to the south. You know, a lot of people would consider that, you know, this rain's just going to grow rubbish. Well, you know, if green leaf has got, you know, certainly a level of energy and protein in it, it's not to say that all green leaves are good protein and good energy, but in some cases that might get people out of a pickle in the short term. Looking at some of your slides, Brett, I hope they're not too recent, some of those, because, you know, serious damage if we don't look to shut up our pastures and get them, you know, give them a chance to get away. At the end of the day, that green leaf, regardless of how big it is, that's just a solar panel for the plant to get energy. And you know, if we keep nipping that green leaf off, that plant will eventually just sort of say, you know, bugger off, I'm sick of you and I'm out of here. So we've got to make sure that even though that incentive to perhaps grab that short green pick, there are you know, potentially animal health issues of a very short green pick. But I took a photo yesterday of some subclover trials that are germinating. Now, I know in the 1st of December when I took the photo, you know, the likelihood of that subclover making January, let alone making next autumn, is probably 0 and none. But that's the sort of implication that we've got coming. There's a lot of, you know, annuals that will stick their head up now. You know, how best we utilise those or build a short-term wedge of feed for, you know, might only be for 14 or 20 days of grazing. But if we can let it go and get into the bottom end of phase 2, you'd be surprised how much feed we can grow. So I don't think there's an easy answer as to, you know, where that rainfall that's all fallen, Brett, as to how much use we can get out of it. I'd like to think we can manage it. If not, you know, build that profile for moisture going into the autumn. And then if we do get some, you know, a break at that stage, that deeper moisture that we want to hang on to, it will really be there to kick the deeper rooted perennials away.
Yeah, without a doubt. And, you know, probably the big take home message for me is, from what you've said and what my experience is too, if you can leave a bit on top, keep your ground cover there, the response once we do get that season goes with us with these rain events can be hugely beneficial. What I would say, and I've been a bit light on it in some of our comments, you know, particularly in some areas in the south, there's still grasses like microlea and the like that will respond to this rain and come away and grow quite substantial amount of feed, of good quality feed as well. Arvo.
Oh yeah, and you can throw warrego in there too, and you know, it is you know, a crackerjack grass to, you know, that's growing, and probably we see it in a greater distribution than we you know, we have seen it in past times. But it does like obviously the wet summers and get up and get going, and it's quality feed. So yeah, there's a lot of it. I mean, let's not throw red grass out. I mean, I've often been a bit harsh on red grass, that it seems to skip through its growth cycle pretty quickly, and to get the best out of it, you need, you know, again, funnily enough, grazing management to get the best out of it. So yeah, they're all there. It's a case of depending on, going back, you made the comment, what's your situation now? What item are we trying to finish? The king of, you know, the king of fodder, lucerne, for those that have got it, and obviously potentially the sheep enterprises. You know, it can rocket along, and I've got plenty of lucerne trials that can see lucerne punch 100 kilos a day at this time of year. So it really is one that if people have got it, just being able to stay off it for 10, 14 days, and they can, you know, seriously build a haystack very quickly.
Another quick question. Just thinking about some of those grasses, I know I found it interesting. Well, lucky the most because of my working with the agronomists and teaching me how to identify grasses, even though I keep joking I'm not the world's best at identifying grasses. Question without notice, is there any resource or something that we could send out to people to help them with identifying some of these summer grasses, some of these ones that are growing and responding?
Oh, look, I think if you went chasing them, there'd be plenty, Brett. I mean, I know the even the LLS, I think, and they've got in their plant identification courses. That'd be the first one that I'd be looking to, is to the resources that, your own team in the LLS, in the agronomy space, that they're putting out there. They're probably some good libels. There is the new book that came out on native grasses. Again, I can't immediately think where it might be hiding online, but it's, a fantastic resource. But they are incredibly hard to identify. That's the bit I will give you in terms of particularly the native grasses. Some of the, the stipers of old, I think there's something like 4,000 subspecies within the stiper collection, and, to know which one is corkscrew and which one's wiregrass and which one's everything else, there's a plethora there. So, yeah, don't expect a correct answer on too many occasions.
That's why I say it's grass. Well, look, thanks very much for everyone for hanging in here with us tonight. Definitely, if you could look at the QR code and scan that, we'll wind it up. Thanks very much, Harbo, for sharing your knowledge and with us here this evening. Hopefully, those people online have got a bit out of it, and really appreciate that. Harbo, are you happy enough with people to contact you if they've got follow-up information?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, no, more than happy to try and help where I can.
Thanks very much, Harbo, and thanks very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. And hopefully we keep getting the rain, and it's not as hot as they're predicting this summer. Appreciate it. Thank you.